My name is Martin Matter with the Witness to War Foundation. It is March 23rd, 2015, and we are in Hiawassee, Georgia. I'm sitting with Mr. Dale Sissell, Sissell, who served in the Vietnam War in the United States Air Force in the 3rd Tactical Fighter Wing, 90th Tactical Fighter Squadron. How are you doing today, Dale?
Fine.
Glad to hear it. My first question is, where are you from originally?
Well, I'm originally from McAllen, Texas, which is 230 miles south of San Antonio, down on the Mexican border. And that area down there is called the Rio Grande Valley.
And what could you tell me about your life growing up?
Well, my father owned a grocery store, but we lived kind of in the country. So I was interested in animals, and I started out raising chickens, graduated to pigs. Eventually I raised calves for the stock show, and that was very enjoyable. Learned a lot, and I graduated from McAllen High School 1951, and really wasn't interested in going to college, but I had a friend that was 1 year ahead of me. He went to Texas A&M, and he talked me into going. And so I went to A&M. At that time, everyone was in the Corps except for the veterans. So, and it was not co-ed. So it was an experience, especially the first couple of years. First year, freshmen ate square meals and were hazed somewhat. And that year when I enrolled, I was placed in the Army. And at that time, the Army, ROTC, had all of the branches of the Army. So I was in the armor, and stayed in that mode until my 3rd year. And I always wanted to fly. During the Second War, I was not even a teenager. I was just a young kid. But I had every fighter in the Army Air Force inventory hanging from my ceiling. These kits came in balsa wood. You glued them together and did what you wanted to with them. So in my junior year, I reminded myself, well, I really didn't have to do that I wanted to fly. I always did. So I went to my professor in armor, who was an Army major, and he was in armor. And I spoke with him a couple hours and told him that I always wanted to fly, and that was really my goal for the next 6 or 8 or 10 years or whatever. So I convinced him, and he said, I'll do anything I can to get you transferred over to the Air Force. What I didn't tell him was that I had already taken the mental test, which was an 8-hour test, 4 hours one day and 4 hours the next. And I knew that I was in good physical condition, so I transferred without any problem at all. Upon graduation in 1955, there was a backlog of people waiting to get into pilot training. So I went out into the oil fields of South Texas and got a job roughnecking. And eventually, well, this went on for about 8 months. Eventually they called me on active duty. I went to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio to what they call pre-flight training school. Was there about a month or 6 weeks, and then went off to pilot training. Flew props during the first 6 months, and then the second part I was transferred to a base in Del Rio and started flying jets, the T-33. And I found real quickly that jets were easier to fly, for me anyway, than props. You didn't have a lot of torque, and they were just easier to fly for me. So I graduated in class 57M at Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio. I was high enough in my class that I was able to select fighters. And so from there, I went to Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix and flew the F-84, which was a Mach 1 aircraft if you could nurse it up to about 43,000, point it straight down. But in level flight, it would not accomplish Mach 1. And then from there, when I graduated from there, went to Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas and graduated into the F-100. I was still a lieutenant at this time. And that was a good assignment too, to that school. We flew air to ground, air to air, and I finished pretty well to the top of my class in the air to ground. And we were shooting, of course, live ammunition. And then from there, I went to my first assignment, which is at Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico, just 9 miles inside the border from Texas. And I was there about a year or so. And then I found out why there was such a backlog to getting into pilot training, because they called about 30 of us into the conference room one day, and they said, all of you are going to desk jobs. And I ended up at Lackland Air Force Base again, and I had a flight of, or really a squadron of cadets that were going through the aviation cadet program. And that was a learning process too. And I spent about a year there and went into Air Force recruiting. And I went around to 4-year colleges and recruited people that did not go through ROTC and could go to officers training school and get a commission in about 3 months. I guess that goes back to the old 90-day wonders. They were graduated as a second lieutenant. Many of them went into navigation training, and many of them went into pilot training. And so from officers, or from the Air Force recruiting, I went to Laredo, Texas, Laredo Air Force Base, and I was a flight instructor, and eventually I was a flight commander, and I had 13 lieutenants. By this time I was a captain, of course. And I had 13 lieutenants working for me and about 45 students. And that was really a learning situation, because we took these officers, they were all officers, out to the airplane and started very basically. This is the nose, this is the tail, and then we went from there. Well, that was a 3-year assignment, and towards the end of the 3 years, I got orders to go to Vietnam. And I had a very good friend that arrived at Laredo the same time I did. So therefore, we both got orders to go to Vietnam at the same time. And, excuse me, we were sent to Luke Air Force Base. And of course, I had already been there. And most of our class had never been inside of an F-100. But this friend of mine, his name was Roger Williamson, everyone called him Willie, of course, and the two of us had already been flying the F-100, so we were kind of considered old hats, and it was kind of a reviewing process for us. But it was the same thing that, kind of the same thing that we went through at Nellis. We had air to ground, air to air. We had, I guess what you'd call dog fights, where our instructor would go up with 3 chicks on his wing and meet another instructor he'd have 3 chicks on his wing, and we'd usually meet about 35,000 feet and have at it. So Willie and I, I should go back a minute. Willie and I were scheduled for a bunch of schools. Counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, I should say, and survival school. I had never been to survival school, and it was in Spokane, Washington. And the final part of it was they took us up on pretty close to the Canadian border, gave us a map, told us you've got to go from here, which is point A, to point B. And we were paired up. I had a young lieutenant paired up with me, and he was raised in Oregon, so he was really half mountain goat, and he kind of led me around, and that took about 3 or 4 days, I suppose, to get from point A to point B, and we didn't have any food. They gave us a fishing line in our pack, and as I recall, we never caught any fish. Never really got hungry. We had a couple of pieces of jerky when we really felt like we needed it, and then when the survival school was over, we went back to Nellis again to about a 2-week ground school to go over all the weapons that were being used in Vietnam, the bombs and what they called them, and so on. And going to this school, we kind of got a hint of maybe everything's not going right. So we reported to Fairchild Air Force Base in California, and we got a change to our orders. And this is when we really found the truth. We were not going to Vietnam to fly the F-100. We were going to go to Vietnam to fly a big gray disc. And we were not, of course, not pleased with that. So when we got to Vietnam, we went into Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base in Saigon. And we were housed in an old French hotel in downtown Saigon because they didn't have enough housing on base. And so we arrived about 10 o'clock one night, and they bussed us into Saigon. And the next morning we went back to Tonsonhoot, had some breakfast in the officers club, and that was quite a sight because 7th Air Force was located at Saigon, or at Tonsonhoot Air Base, and it was a 24-hour operation, of course. They had crews, nearly all pilots, that manned these desk jobs in 7th Air Force. And when we went into the club, the night crew was in the officers club, and they were all at the bar to get a drink. Of course, since this was 9 o'clock in the morning or so, Willie and I weren't into having a drink. We wanted some breakfast. And so we had some breakfast, and after that, we went over to 7th Air Force headquarters to personnel. And so we were led to a second lieutenant there in personnel. So Willie and I just told him flat out that this is not what we came over here for, to Vietnam, and that we were not going to report to our jobs, because if we did, then we were stuck. So we told him he had better get us 2 flying assignments in the same squadron, and don't take a lot of time doing it. So for the next week, Willie and I would go to the club every morning, have breakfast, go over and check on our second lieutenant. I think really he was afraid of us. And every morning he'd say, "I'm working on it, I'm working on it." So for that week, we'd hang around the club. They had a veranda over the top of the club that was covered, and all the sides were open, so if there was a breeze to be had, you could get it up there. And they served sandwiches and drinks up there. And it was just a good place to hang out. And Willie and I both ran into people that we had been stationed with before, and flew probably the 100 or some other aircraft similar. And one day I met a pilot that I had known before, and he said, "You know, this outfit that you're supposed to be in has been expecting you any day, because they know when you arrived in country." And I said, "Well, don't even admit to them that you even know me, and we'll see how things turn out." Well, he told me what this outfit was. It sounded very interesting. It was called CHECO, CHECO, and I don't remember what that stands for, but their job was to document the history of the Vietnam War, and all the people in that outfit had blanket orders, and they could go anywhere in the theater that they felt like they needed to go. So I thought, well, if we don't get a flying job, that sounds pretty good to me, because I had already done a lot of writing. And so eventually we went to the club one Saturday morning. Then we went over to check on our second lieutenant. When we walked in, he was beaming like the sun that just came up. He was smiling. He says, "I have your assignment in the F-100. Where's that?" Well, he said, "It's at Benoit Air Base, which is only about 18 or 20 miles from here." So the next morning, which was a Sunday morning, we went to base ops with our personal gear, and we actually had our parachute with us. I don't know why, because they never used it. But we caught a chopper ride over to Benoit, and the ops officer was there to meet us. And he took us down to the squadron building and met our squadron commander, and he was a Texas Aggie in the class of 50. So when he saw my ring, he, of course, wanted to know all about how A&M was doing and everything. And as it turned out, there were five pilots in the squadron that were from Texas. Not all from A&M. We had one lieutenant in the squadron, and he graduated from TCU, Texas Christian, and everyone in the squadron gave him a hard time because he was a lieutenant. Everyone else in the squadron were mostly captains and majors, a couple lieutenant colonels, which was my commander. And our lieutenant was there when I got there, so he left before I did. And when I heard by the grapevine that he got out of the Air Force, went back to school, and went to law school. And very shortly after he graduated, several years, he was the president of the Texas Bar Association. He was a sharp kid. And then within a couple of days, Willie and I were on the schedule to get our first flight. Well, we had two F-100Fs, which meant they had 2 seats. So my first flight was in the back seat of the 100. And my first flight was with Captain Bobby Mahoney, who was from San Antonio. And it was just a typical flight, I would say, which I didn't know at the time. And then on the next flight, we were in a 100 that only had a single seat. And that's what we had throughout the squadron, single seat, single engine. And that was a learning thing too, because I'd flown the F-100, but never in combat. And of course, I was teamed up with a flight commander of that flight was actually my flight commander, and his name was Captain Jack Daub. And quite a guy. He presently lives in South Georgia, and I talk to him on the phone, I would say, every other month. And he earned the title of the Golden G-suit because of the hairy experiences he got into, and he knew how to get out. As I remember, he had an offer to go to the University of Georgia to play football, but he turned that down. He said he wasn't interested in football. He wanted to go through ROTC and fly, and that was kind of the story with all of us. We had this burning desire to fly, and so most of our missions were we were armed with the Mark 82 500-pound bomb and 20 millimeter, which we call 20 Mike. And we'd typically drop our bombs first, all 4 aircraft, maybe 2 aircraft, as it turned out to be a lot of times. We'd drop our bombs, and then we would strafe. And we were always under the control of a forward air controller, a FAC. And he was flying a light aircraft, the 01, which had a top speed of probably 100 knots. But he would direct us into the target and typically would put down a phosphorus rocket, and then he would say either hit the smoke or hit the smoke 20 or 30 meters to the right or to the left or whatever. And so I did real well on dropping the bombs and strafing and what have you. And there was a pilot that came in shortly after I did, maybe a month, and he was not very well adapted to the situations that we were in. And unfortunately, I heard him being chewed out by his flight commander. And he said, "Now, John, you're going to have to put the bombs on the target. They can't, go out a half a mile from here. You got to put the bombs on the target." He said, "We have a reputation to uphold in this squadron, the 90th Tactical Fighter Squadron, and which was commonly known as DICE. The name was Paradise Squadron, and it was shortened to DICE. And that was our call sign on every mission. DICE 01, DICE 05, or whatever. As a sidelight, we got dice that they used on the crap tables in either Las Vegas or Reno, I don't remember. And we'd drill a hole through each die and then put a little short chain through the die and put it on our zipper of the flying suit. The zipper, of course, went from our neck to the crotch. And after we flew our first combat flight, we were awarded the dice, which was a big deal to us, to everybody. And the facts throughout Vietnam, or I should say South Vietnam, pretty well knew who DICE was. And they said, we were lucky when we get a DICE flight because they do put the bombs on the target. And they would say, the F-4s don't normally do that. Nothing against the F-4s because they were good guys too, but maybe they weren't as experienced as we were. I'm not sure. And so the mission, my tour went pretty well uneventful. Sometimes I'd come back from a flight and there would be a few bullet holes in the aircraft, and everybody experienced that. And I was on a night mission one time. The mission started in the day. It was late, very late in the day, and it got dark while we were airborne. As a matter of fact, while we were on the target. And I remember pulling off the target one time, and I was in a left turn and pulling G's, of course, and I looked back. I don't know why I looked back, but I did. I looked back over my shoulder, and here came these, what I would call grapefruit, towards me. And those were the bad guys shooting at me. And I don't know what to say about the rest of my tour. I remember I had a very enjoyable time on. The ops officer chose me to go with him to Taiwan to pick up a couple of aircraft that were being modified somehow. I don't remember what the modification was, but we got on a contract air flight and went to Japan. Then we caught a flight back down to Okinawa, and then we caught another flight to Taiwan in Taipei. And then in Taipei, we got on a Chinese airway, an old C-47 that took us down towards the middle of the country where these modifications were being made. And there were a group of pilots there that flew the aircraft just to make sure it was stable after they did the work. They were kind of like test pilots, I suppose. And so, of course, when we got there, they said the birds were not ready. So we went back to Taipei, did a little shopping there, and then went back to Tainan. And of course, all the food we had was Chinese, except in the club at this facility where we were picking up the birds. And so they finally got one ready. And my ops officer said, "Dale," he said, "let's do this." He said, "You take the one that's ready and go on down to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and I'll meet you there." So that was fine with me. So I took off, and it was IFR, completely overcast, and probably had thunderstorms up to 30,000 feet. So I was in it, and after about 10 minutes, I discovered that my radio was out. And then I thought, well, I'll just maintain this last course that air traffic control gave me, and maybe the radio will come back on, who knows? Maybe it had a little water, needed to dry out and whatever. So I thought, well, sometimes to get out of a situation like this, you can turn the TACAN up, the volume up. Most of the time they're giving weather and that sort of thing. But when I turned it up this time, it was the guys at Clark, Air Traffic Control, and they were calling me, Dice 02, and so they gave me some different headings to fly, so that they made sure that they had radar contact. So when they finally got radar contact, they proceeded to direct me to Clark. The flight from where we were in Taiwan to Clark is only about an hour. So as I got closer to the base, they started letting me down, flying different headings, and got me on final approach. I was flying a ground control approach, and they were giving me heading changes of maybe 2 degrees, so I knew that I was on final approach. And then I broke out. It must have been about 900 feet overcast when I broke out. I landed and rode up the aircraft as having a radio failure. And then they put, for housing, the BOQ was the bachelor officer quarters were full, so they put me in a trailer, small trailer, that was used one time for flights that flew at night, and all the windows were painted black, and if they were scrambled, then they would already have their night vision. And during the 4 or 5 days I was there, it was great because I went to the club every morning and had a great breakfast. As a matter of fact, I had a lot of great meals in the club there. American food, was not powdered milk or anything like that. They had the real stuff. And then in the basement of the club, they had the Rathskeller that was open 24 hours a day. You could get drinks or sandwiches in the Rathskeller. And I remember going into the club off to the left, before you really got into the main part of the club, off to the left there was a little room over there, and I wandered in there one time, and it was a poker game. Went on 24 hours a day. Not the same people, but the game went on. And I remember one of the men in this poker game was a civilian, and I met him later, some years later, when I was later stationed at Clark, and everyone called him Digger Odell because he was he was in charge of the morgue. So Digger he played a lot of poker in that room. But every day I would go down to base ops, and my ops officer's name was Ron Burdoy. And I would go to base ops and find out if he maybe had come in and I didn't know it, or maybe he was coming in. No Ron. So I think it was after about 5 days, I got real impatient, and I thought, well, I need to get back to Benoit. So I met a flight of F4 pilots and base ops that were leaving the next day, and they were going to another base that was Cameron Bay is where they were going, which was located right on the coast of the South China Sea. And I started talking to the flight commander, and I asked him if there was any chance I could tack on to his flight to go to Benoit. He said, of course. He said, about 100 miles out, he said, you can break off and go to Benoit, and then we'll turn a little bit to the right and go to Cameron Bay. I said, hey, that sounds great. So the next morning we blasted off, good weather, and after I landed at Benoit, the squadron commander was there to meet me. And he said, Dale, where in the hell have you been? And I said, well, I've been at Clark about the last 4 or 5 days. And I told him that the ops officer had told me to go ahead, and then he would be along as soon as they got his aircraft ready. Well, I think he probably got to Clark the day after I left there to go home. Not home, but Benoit. And he probably experienced the same thing I did. All the good food. By the way, they had an orchestra in the club, a 21-piece orchestra that was made up of Filipinos. Played the best music in the world. All of it American music. But anyway, he said, "Where's Ron?" I said, I have no idea. I said, and I gave him the details. He said, "Well, I guess he'll be along eventually." And eventually he did, 4 or 5 days later. So I suppose he and the squadron commander had a very heart-to-heart talk about him dragging his feet, getting back to Benoit. I don't know. And then somewhere during the tour, General Mollmeyer, who was the commander of 7th Air Force, and by the way, he was my commander at Cannon Air Force Base too. He had 1 star then, and I think there were probably 2 wings there. Quite a gaggle of aircraft. But anyway, by this time he had 4 stars, and he made a trip around to all the fighter bases, and he made the comment that to his staff that it looked to him like the pilots were flying their 1 mission a day and then hanging around the swimming pool the rest of the day. Well, he must have been talking about Thailand, because they had pools. In Vietnam, we didn't have pools. But we were thrown in as being like them. So he said, "Okay, here's what I want. Pilots continue to fly their 1 mission a day, and then for the rest of the day, they're going to have an additional duty, like the assistant maintenance officer, assistant supply officer, and so on." Well, I was designated to be the aide to the wing commander for a half day, so that I could fly the other half day. And then there was another captain who was designated the same way. He was an aide to the wing commander for half the day. Well, on one day, the commander said, "Dale, go out and get the car, and I'll meet you out in front of the headquarters." So I got the staff car. He jumped in, and he said, "I have a friend that's going to be arriving soon, and we're going to meet him at the club for lunch." Well, he didn't say who the friend was, but he did say he was the wing commander over there at Clark, and at that time they were flying the F-102. So, and the flight from Clark to Benoit was about 2 hours, maybe an hour 50, depending on the winds. So we went into the club. Of course, there wasn't anyone there. No one ate in the club at noon. And we went to the commander's table, which is always reserved. We ordered a glass of iced tea and sit there. Well, eventually this man came in the front door of the club, and we both stood up, and I started looking for his name tag. Well, before he got to our table, of course, I could read it, and it said Yeager, Chuck Yeager, who made history before he attained the rank of colonel. As a matter of fact, he was probably a captain when he broke all these records, such as the speed of sound and what have you. And the wing commander introduced me, and Chuck Yeager said, "I'm very, very glad to meet you, Captain." So we sat down and we ordered a sandwich. Of course, during the meal, I didn't say one word. I just sat there and listened to them. And I kept saying to myself, you know, Dale, you're living a little bit of history right here, having lunch with Chuck Yeager. And so we finished the meal, and Colonel Yeager went off in his direction. They had a staff car for him, and parked him in front of base ops, of course. And when we were going back to the headquarters, I asked my commander, said, "Have you known Colonel Yeager very long?" He said, "Oh yeah." He said, "We went through pilot training together. And then we were transferred to Europe, and we were in the same outfit over there." So he said, "I've known him for a number of years." I think Colonel Yeager was shot down over there in Europe and made his way back to, I think it was France, and he was escorted by some people that were underground, and they went through part of Spain to get there. But anyway, that's enough of Colonel Yeager. Our squadron, the 90th Attack Fighter Squadron, we were one of originally, I think, 4 squadrons. One of the squadrons left while we were there. The 531st, who were called the Buzzards, they left and were transferred to another base. And so the 510th, which was called the Ramrods, they were right next to us. And we traded pilots back and forth, sometimes to make up a flight of 4. One time I was told to go over and join with a flight over there. I went over, and their mascot, of course our mascot was the dice. Their mascot, the Ramrod, was a snake, pet snake. It was a boa constrictor. And while we were briefing, that snake came in, wrapped around the legs of the table, settled on the top of the table, and went to sleep. That was kind of unnerving. But anyway, we went on the flight, and as we say sometimes when we get back from a flight, well, we killed a lot of trees, because to us that's all we saw. Most of the areas in South Vietnam had a double canopy of trees, and there wasn't any way you could see the ground. But we came back from that mission, and I was told about a month later, or everyone in the flight was told, that we killed a Russian general, because the ground forces went in after we bombed and found him. Well, that's pretty unusual. And the 90th was unusual in a very special way, in that during my year there, we did not have any fatalities from combat. We did have 2 fatalities from accidents, very unfortunate accidents. One was a lieutenant that came into the squadron, and on his, I guess he had already been checked out, but on the 7th day that he was there, which was a Sunday morning. He was in a flight of 2. He was teamed up with one of the more experienced pilots in the squadron. And we didn't take off together in formation. We usually had about, I think it was 7-second spacing. So the lead took off, and right after he took off and got his gear up, he had a firelight. So he pulled up into a closed downwind to get it on the ground as soon as possible. And he could see number 2 breaking ground. So he said, Dice 02, how about checking me over for a fire? Well, the lead aircraft jettisoned his bombs before he pulled up, because you didn't want to do that sort of a maneuver with that much weight. Well, when number 2 pulled up, he had forgotten to jettison his bombs. And about halfway through the pull-up, he had already come out of afterburner. And during the pull-up, with all that weight, he stalled, went in. And we had barely got to know him. I think his name was Paul Strahl. He was a first lieutenant. And the other accident we had was with a very experienced pilot, and he went up on a mission the day before he was supposed to get on the Freedom Bird, as we call it. And so when he led the flight back, he told the rest of the flight to go ahead and land, which they did. And he was orbiting at about 10,000 feet. And he got permission from the tower to make a high-speed flight, or pass over the squadron building, which was located right on a taxiway. Well, he put it into a dive with afterburner and got all the airspeed he could get out of it. And right over our squadron building, he made a sharp pull-up, and one of the wings came off. So he went into a flat spin and was not able to get out of the aircraft. That wing that came off went over into a maintenance area of another squadron, and there was an airman standing out on the ramp, and that wing cut that airman in half. So he died the same day that Clyde Carter died. That was his name. He was a captain too. And I was on my way from the wing headquarters. Every pilot on the base had a Honda 90 because it was a big base. So I was on the way down to the flight line on my Honda, and that was when Clyde came over and made the sharp pull-up, and I saw the canopy go about the same time that the wing came off. Of course, he didn't survive because with those lateral G's, there was no way that he could pull the handles and get out. So there were two tragedies that day. The maintenance airman who was in our squadron, and Clyde Carter. Well, when the canopy came off, the guys that were closer than I was said they could see his helmet flying through the air. And when they found his helmet, his head was in it. So he really didn't have much idea of what went on. Well, we progressed on to the Tet of '68, which in the South, all hell broke loose. And I was scheduled with one other aircraft. I was the lead. I was scheduled with one other aircraft to go down in the Delta, what the Army called 4 Corps. They divided the country up into corps, I Corps being up near the DMZ, and the 4 Corps was down in the Delta. And I'm sorry, we were not scheduled either. Both of us, well, the two of us were sitting on alert. And the people that scrambled the people on alert knew which bombs and we were carrying and so on. And the red telephone rang, and the guy that answered it said, "Scramble dice." So off we went out the door, and our aircraft was sitting right there, ready to go. So we jumped in our aircraft, and typically you would start the aircraft and be taxiing out, doing all of your checks, sometimes even fastening seatbelt. And we got off the ground. We were given a heading to fly. Eventually, we were given a frequency to change to. And the fact said, "Good morning, Dice. I'm your fact today. And we have troops in contact." As it turned out, they weren't our troops. They were South Vietnamese troops. But our mission was to support all the ground troops in South Vietnam, regardless of which country they came from. So we went in and dropped a couple of bombs each, and then we dropped what they designate as CBU-2, clustered bomb units, and there are several different types, but these were CBU-2s. And they're pods that hang underneath the wing, and these pods were loaded with bombs, small bombs. I shouldn't call them bombs, they were about like hand grenades. So they were anti-personnel. So the fact would direct us in over the bad guys, and we would punch a button. Those CBUs would start dispensing. And fortunately, we didn't have to make more than 2 passes, because when you're over the bad guys, you don't know what's coming back at you. And so then we started strafing. And on one of the strafing passes, I pulled off into a steep climb, and the firelight came on. And my wingman said, "Dice Lee, you're on fire." I said, "Yes, I know, I've got a firelight." Well, we were north of the Mekong River, maybe 5 or 10 miles. And south of the Mekong River, there was a U.S. base that the FACS flew out of, but it didn't have any fighters. So I headed towards that base, and my plan was to eject over the runways, even though I was on fire. Well, my first plan was, in my mind, was, hey, maybe I can land this aircraft. But then I changed my mind because the stick started getting mushy, and I knew then that the flight controls were beginning to burn through. So then I told my wingman that I was going to have to eject. Well, by this time I was over the runway, about ready to eject. My wingman said, "Don't go now." He said, "Turn about 30 degrees because there's a little village ahead, and you don't want your aircraft to hit there." He didn't say that, but that was the thinking. So I turned about 30 degrees and ejected, and I landed in a banana plantation. I ended up in a banana tree, and I got out of my chute, kept my helmet on, got my pistol out. We all had 38 caliber pistols. And while I was coming down, I could see the nearest exit out of that banana plantation. And I also saw a woman walking the trail next to the edge of this plantation. She had one of those little pointy hats on, but she never even looked up at me. I suppose she didn't want to acknowledge that I was even there. And when I ran out to the nearest place, there was a chopper out maybe 75 or 80 meters, and the crew was motioning for me to come on out and get on board, and I did. So we were only maybe a mile, maybe 2 miles from the air base, and the commander or the pilot of this chopper, it was a UH-1 Army helicopter. He said, "Well, we've got to sit here a while and get permission from the tower to come on in." So I was sitting on the floor of the helicopter, and we were kind of shooting the bull. And I asked him, I said, "By the way, what's your name?" And he kind of came to a brace, even though he was sitting down. And he said, "Sir, my name is Warrant Officer Richard Nixon." I said, "You are kidding me." "No, I'm not kidding." And the rest of the air crew backed him up. "That's right, his name is Richard Nixon." So we finally got cleared into the base. A Jeep picked me up there and took me to the flight surgeon, and he checked over my vital signs. I sat down at his desk, and he said, "How about telling me the whole story, how this happened?" And so while we were sitting there, he reached into the bottom drawer of his desk, and he said, "How about a little shot of Mekong Delta, which is rot gut?" I said, "Sure." So he poured me a little glass of bourbon, and we sat there, and we toasted, and he said, "Well, here's to the rest of your tour." I said, "I appreciate that." So my squadron commander said, "Since you're bunged up a little bit," I had scratches and all kinds of things. And he said, "While you're resting up, why don't you go to Bangkok?" He said, "We have a C-47 that goes over there a couple of times a week." He said, "Go to Bangkok and do a little rest and relaxation." I wasn't in favor of it at first, but I kind of decided that might be a good deal. So I think there were about a half dozen of us got on that C-47. The chaplain and I were the only commissioned officers. The rest were airmen, sergeants. So the 5 or 6 days I was there, once again, ate some very good food. They had a swimming pool at the hotel, and there were a bunch of F-4 pilots there. So we kind of traded war stories. And I finally thought, well, I'm a flight commander, and I know that we're a little bit short of pilots. I think I better get on back to Benoit. So I caught another C-47, got back to Benoit, and I flew one scheduled flight, which was uneventful. And then the next day, I was scheduled to sit on alert. Once again, it was on alert. You normally have a leader and a wingman, and so we were sitting there, and the phone rang, the red phone, and 7th Air Force had scrambled us once again. And this time it was deep in the Delta. As a matter of fact, probably from 20,000 feet, you could see the end of Vietnam and what they call the Gulf of Siam. And we had a FAC that directed us into the mission. Once again, we had a couple of bombs hanging and CBUs, and there were troops in contact. In other words, they were head to head just about. And we dropped our bombs, and then I was in the process of dropping my pods, and this was standard procedure. We tried to drop our pods in some water so that Charlie, the VC, could not get these pods and pull some of those grenades out of there, and they would typically make booby traps out of those. So I spotted a canal, and it was wide and it was long. I spotted this canal, and I was going down the canal. I punched off my pods and started a pull-up, and about maybe 200 feet, the aircraft started rolling. And I couldn't counteract the rolling with ailerons or a rudder. And when it reached about 60 degrees of bank, I said, it's time to go. So I pulled the handles. My wingman said that I got one call off to him. His name was Phil Carson, and everyone called him Kit Carson. And he was a former navigator who went to pilot training, and this was one of his first assignments, was to Vietnam. And he said that I got a call off to him before I ejected. I said, what was the call? He said, Phil, I'm going. I don't remember saying that. Anyway, I did not eject in favorable conditions because the surface wind was about 25 knots. When I hit the ground, I heard a crack, and it was my knee that broke. And the wind was dragging me along through this rice paddy. The rice paddy was like concrete because this was during the dry season. So I finally got the chute under control and laid on it. And my wingman was still up there circling me. the FAC was still on the scene, and the FAC was giving him directions to where to strafe these VC, maybe North Vietnamese, probably. This was during the Tet, 68. And so this went on for probably 45 minutes, and my wingman said, "Lead, I've got to go. I'm low on fuel." So I said, "Go." Well, to back up a little bit, the reason I was able to talk to him on the radio, because every survival vest had a radio, and UHF. And so I was able to talk with my wingman and the FAC. So I told Phil, "Go. We don't want two pilots down here." So he really didn't make it home. He had to land short and refuel and then proceed on. And my FAC was giving me a running commentation on what was going on. He said, "Charlie is in a bamboo hut about 150 meters from your position." So I had my pistol out, and unfortunately, when my wingman left, I could hear the roar of his jet disappearing. And I could almost read Charlie's mind. "Oh, now we've got him. His wingman's gone." So they proceeded to come towards my position. They knew exactly where I was. And my wingman couldn't do much. He said, "I've got an M16. I could probably keep a few of them off." I said, "Well, do the best you can." And the VC got within about 50 meters of me. And I knew I was going to die, because they were mad because of what we had just done to them. Usually they try to capture a pilot, but not always. And the gory part of when they catch a pilot or capture one, they told me this in the first week I was there, that a couple of pilots that had been shot down, when they found them, their gonads had been cut off and sewn up in their mouth, probably while they were still alive, no way of telling. So I didn't think there was any danger of that. I thought they would probably kill me. But I had my pistol out, and I thought, well, I can take a couple of them down anyway before they get me. And about this time, I heard a chopper coming from my rear. Whoop, 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 whoop. Sweetest sound I've ever heard. It was an Army chopper and a UH-1 once again. And they landed probably 25 or 30 meters from my position, but away from Charlie. And they were waving for me to get on board. And I stood up, and my legs wouldn't hold me. I collapsed. And so I waved to them to come get me. A couple of them jumped out of the chopper, got on each side of me, and got me on board the chopper. And they took me into a Vietnamese airfield. The chopper said, "I've got to refuel." So he went into base ops, take care of that. while I was lying there on the floor of the chopper, a Vietnamese general came out and to talk to me. He said, "We really appreciate what you did today, but unfortunately, I see that you've got a broken leg." And I said, "Yes, I do." And there was a medic on board that gave me some painkiller. And the pilot eventually came out of base ops and he said, "Okay, we're gonna take you over here to the coast to a U.S. airfield." I don't recall the name. They didn't have any fighters there, but they had FACs and a lot of ground troops stationed there. So it was about an hour flight. And when we got over there, there was an Air Force chopper there waiting on me that had a longer range than this Army chopper did. So they carried me on a litter over to the Air Force chopper, and one of the crew peeled back a cigar, stuck it in my mouth. Of course, I couldn't light it, but I chewed on it anyway. And then they were taking me back towards Saigon. And the pilot told me that they were not allowed to fly at night. And it was getting real late in the day by then. So they landed at a field hospital, which is very similar to what you saw on MASH. They were not in tents. They were in kind of a bubble structure. And so they brought me in there on the litter. There wasn't much they could do for me. But after a while, one of the medics came around and he said, "We've got some intel information that the VC are going to be rocketing near here tonight." So they said, "We're going to put you in a bunker, a highly fortified bunker, sandbags and a little bit of steel." And I wasn't the only one in there. There were a bunch of soldiers in there. Excuse me.
Dale, I'm sorry to have to do this, but we've gone over our allotted time for today. I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to share your story with me, but most importantly, I'd like to thank you very much for your service.
You're welcome.